Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How the heck are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. It's good to see you. It's good to be here. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We're going to talk this time around about the potential link between seed oils, inflammation, and colon cancer risk. The big question we are aiming to answer with this episode: how concerned should we be about seed oils in our diet when it comes to colon cancer risk? So let's jump right in. Where did this idea come from? Why are we tackling it this time around?
Yeah. Well, thanks to Marco. He kind of sent in the whole idea here. Although I did see this getting floated around the news media blogosphere in December. It certainly got a lot of press coverage. So he had sent me this article, but there's a couple different ones out there. One of them, the headline in Science Daily was "Ultra-Processed Foods May Drive Colorectal Cancer Risk, Study Finds." And then in the Scientific American Journal, the title was kind of "Ultra-Processed Foods High in Seed Oils Could Be Fueling Colon Cancer Risk." So he was kind of writing in being like, hey, took a look at these articles. He also tracked down the science study and was like, I don't really understand how they're making this conclusion. So that's really the topic
Shout
today.
out to Marco doing
I know. Yeah, it was awesome. But what is kind of the link between the seed oils and colon cancer risk, and what, if anything, to do about it? Now, what's interesting about this is that colon cancer is our third most common cancer after breast and prostate, but it's the second most common in terms of cancer deaths after lung. So we've had so many great treatment advancements for breast and prostate that although colon cancer is a little bit less likely, it tends to be more deadly. And we've also found that there's this trend that more and more young people are developing colon cancer, kind of at an alarming rate. So around 2010, when adults are less than 50 years old, that only accounted for about 5% of colon cancers. But by 2020, so only 10 years later, that had doubled to about 10%. So millennials are twice as likely to get colon cancer compared to people, let's say, born in 1950. So doubling the risk kind of in this short time period is certainly, like I said, alarming. And we want to figure out why it is. I'm willing to say right now is sort of a punchline. I think diet has something to do with it. Whether or not it's seed oils, I guess we're going to find out as we go here.
Great. And as you're saying that, I do remember seeing, headlines about that increase in colon cancer risk in, whether it's millennials or whatnot. So yeah, I do remember seeing that. So as you mentioned, it has been in the news for a bit. Okay. So we've talked about seed oils before. What do we need to know, or what do we need to remember about them to understand this, what we need to understand for this conversation?
Yeah. I think fats are pretty complicated for lots of reasons, but part of the reason is there's different types of fats, and then within the different types of fats, there's subtypes of fats, and they all have different names. So it gets kind of hard to track of anything very quickly. And so we've got these three main types of fat: monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated. And of course, like I said, there's different subtypes of each of those. Within the polyunsaturated fats, this is where we have these categories that people have heard and know about as omega-6 fats and omega-3 fats. They're a way to categorize the different subtypes of the polyunsaturated fats. And I'd love to be able to skip all of this, but again, these names are kind of thrown around the media, and it also forms the basis or the hypothesis of this whole study. So we kind of have to hear these things to make sense of it all. But what you hear a lot in the media is that these omega-6 fats of the polyunsaturated fat type are what drive inflammation. They're often called pro-inflammatory. And then it's the omega-3 fats that are still, again, polyunsaturated fats, but they're the ones that reduce inflammation. These are the ones that are supposedly anti-inflammatory. And it is true that the presence of these different fats or fatty acids can influence what signaling molecules are created by the immune system, which ultimately can be part of inflammation, because inflammation just is a lot of signals from the immune system saying like, hey, something's going on over here. Now, omega-6 fats are what's high in seed oils. Back in my day, when I was caught up in all of the fear-mongering that exists on social media about perfectly healthy foods, I knew to be scared of them as vegetable oils, but now the words that we're using are seed oils, but they're one and the same. Vegetable oils are extracted from seeds or other parts of the fruit. In the US, 90% of the vegetable or seed oils that we consume are going to be soybean, canola, corn, and palm oils. And these are the types of fats that are pretty much used in all of the different processed foods, the chips, the bread products, desserts even, and so on. Now, again, this is where we kind of get technical with all the names. The main omega-6 fat in the seed oils or in the vegetable oils that we're told to fear is something called linoleic acid. And what's interesting is that linoleic acid is actually an essential fat. We must obtain it from the diet. So there is some dose that is healthy and essential. And then the body has the ability to convert linoleic acid into something called arachidonic acid. And it's this molecule, arachidonic acid, that people typically fear because it's arachidonic acid that has this potential to create these pro-inflammatory molecules. And this is really kind of the hypothesis of the paper. And it's really the hypothesis of when many people are talking about, okay, seed oils cause inflammation. It's the idea that we're eating these vegetable oils, seed oils, if you will, in processed foods. They're high in linoleic acid. The body's going to convert it to arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid generates these inflammatory molecules, and voila, we have a problem. It could be any of our chronic diseases. That's how we hear about this in, again, the media and saying, okay, we just have inflammation. But in the case of this paper, their hypothesis is, okay, all of that inflammation can start to lead to colorectal cancer, colon cancer development. So the theory goes anyway.
Okay, well, you just led me into the next question, which so the theory goes. Sounds like you don't buy into the theory. Talk to me a little bit about the hypothesis. Talk to me a little bit about where, assuming you do have some disagreements with it, like where are the flaws in it?
Yeah, there's a bunch. I mean, we have to remember that inflammation is not all bad. Just to be like, oh gosh, something's pro-inflammatory. Okay, we have to end that or stop that. Because inflammation is the necessary first step of the healing process. It's the signals of the immune system saying, hey, there's something going on here. There's a problem. Come fix it. So we have to catch ourselves even when something like inflammation goes up. Inflammation goes up after exercise, but nobody stops exercise because it's inflammatory in the short term. We know in the long term it's anti-inflammatory. So that's the first thing. We just sort of have to like step back and not be so fearful of inflammation and always keep looking at what the end result is, because that's going to guide us as to whether or not this inflammation is harmful. The second flaw is this notion that omega-6s in particular always result in inflammation. That's not true. Omega-6 fats can also produce anti-inflammatory molecules just like the omega-3. So always thinking omega-6 is pro-inflammatory and omega-3 is anti-inflammatory is also too simplistic to what actually happens in terms of the physiology. But finally, a really big breakdown in this theory is that we find that the arachidonic acid levels don't change with linoleic acid intake. So there's this study in humans, it's the Rett study in the show notes. Whether they decrease the amount of linoleic acid, that's the one that we find in a high concentration in the seed oils, whether or not they decrease the amount that people are eating by 90%, all the way up to 600%, doesn't actually change the levels of arachidonic acid in the person. In other words, there can be this huge swing in your linoleic acid intake, and yet the arachidonic acid, the one that everybody fears, those levels stay pretty much unchanged. And this actually makes a good amount of sense because we know the conversion between linoleic acid and arachidonic acid is actually really low, about 0.2%. You can think about it as out of 1,000 molecules, there's going to be 2 molecules that go through this conversion process from the linoleic acid to the arachidonic acid. So we would expect that even though somebody has a very large intake of linoleic acid, we can't say that it's increasing the arachidonic acid to the same levels. So, this is where kind of the whole premise of this study is a little bit wrong. It sort of is making the assumption, okay, well, we're taking in all this linoleic acid from the vegetable oils and the seed oils, and therefore arachidonic acid is going up, and therefore that's driving inflammation. Well, we have evidence to the contrary saying, well, it turns out that you can have a really big swing in the linoleic acid from your veggie oils, and not much happens to the arachidonic acid.
We keep talking about a study. What was the study? Can you give us a little bit of background and some context to what they were looking at?
Yeah, so the study took 81 samples from people who had colorectal cancer. Basically, they took a sample of their colon that was the cancer cells, and they looked at, hey, what are the fats that are present there? What are some of the genes that are expressed there? The paper does get pretty technical because it's talking about gene expression, but basically these cancer samples, because they also took some control samples that were not cancer tissue. Basically, the cancer tissue had a greater amount of omega-6 fats, and especially the arachidonic acid fats, of course, related to the hypothesis that we just went through. And they had less presence of omega-3 fats. Now, the big limitations with this study is there was no analysis or control for the people's diet. So they just took samples from people that had colorectal cancer, colon cancer, but they didn't actually ask them what their diet was. I'm sure that some of them do have the standard American diet, the processed diet, but we don't actually know. Some of them could have colorectal cancer and just be eating lots of fruits and veggies, because there are people that have that happen as well. We don't know, and we can't assume. So the idea of trying to draw a conclusion that's saying this is the result of the diet without actually measuring the diet is a big problem. You can't make that conclusion. You can't make that jump. Sure, you can have this hypothesis. Sure, you could have observed something in the cancer cells. But to be able to specifically say this is related to their intake, well, guess what? We'd actually have to measure their intake. Further, when we look at other evidence, besides what I already talked about, the low conversion rate and the fact that the fatty acid in the vegetable oils doesn't actually get to this, quote, harmful arachidonic acid, we can also look at studies that do look at dietary intake. And what I've found is that there's no obvious link between omega-6, fatty acid intake, and cancer. This is the 2020 Hansen paper in the show notes. Quote, evidence for effects of omega-6 on all cancer outcomes was unclear and of very low quality. So definitely not the evidence to say that it's driving cancer. And then the Kim paper in the show notes is a little bit stronger. This one's also from 2020, saying that the intake of the omega-6 fats was not significantly associated with the risk of cancer. And actually, when people had higher blood levels of the omega-6 fats, it was inversely associated with the risk of cancer. Therefore, higher levels of omega-6 in the blood were decreasing the risk of cancer. So the weight of evidence right now, when we actually look at okay, what are people eating in terms of omega-6, i.e. seed oils, in the diet, and then what happens to them in terms of their cancer risk, you could say it's at worst neutral, but at best potentially protective.
At the top of this, you sort of alluded to the fact that diet has something to do with this, right? If it's not seed oils, or at least it doesn't appear to be seed oils, where do we go now?
Yeah.
If we can't point at that, what can we start to look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of our big organizations have some really great information on their websites, although it's not flashy and big edits and whiz bang. It's not that interesting maybe to look at.
Not a lot of whiz bang.
There's not a lot of whiz bang on the old American Institute for Cancer Research website or the American Cancer Society or any of these big organizations. But from the American Institute for Cancer Research, they say there's convincing evidence that processed meat, alcoholic drinks, and obesity increases colon cancer risk, and probable evidence that whole grains, foods with fiber, and dairy products decrease the risk. They also say that red meat increases risk, but the evidence is not quite as strong as what they see for processed meat or alcoholic drinks or obesity. And we actually have a podcast, of course, on the specifics of red and processed meat relative to colon cancer that we'll drop in the show notes. But, coming back to seed oils, I think if somebody has a lot of seed oils in their diet, there's a good chance they don't have a ton of those protective more foods that they listed, the whole grains, the foods with the fiber. And if somebody has a lot of seed oils in their diet, they have a good chance to have excess weight or have obesity, right? Because where we see seed oils, they're so ubiquitous in processed foods that if somebody has a lot of seed oils in their diet, probably the processed foods are pushing out what we think are going to be more of those protective foods. And really, it's going to be the fiber that we're really interested in for colon cancer. And we also find that obesity is linked not just to colon cancer, but to 14 other different cancers in terms of increasing risk. So it could be that the seed oil food choices are A, pushing out what would be more protective foods in the diet, or B, because they're these delicious processed foods that are so easy to overeat, are also driving obesity, and it's more of the obesity that's increasing the risk than, let's say, the canola oil per se. Just as an aside, I mean, we also have a podcast just only on fiber, and fiber for Americans, a really good guideline's about 30 grams a day. It's not perfect for everyone. That's just a good general number to know. I think it's worth people taking a day and looking at how many grams of fiber just are in their diet. Take a typical day, add up all the fiber. It's about 90 to 95% of Americans aren't getting that. So very good chance, just like our fruit and vegetable consumption, that it's not you. And this is one of the great ways that you can actually decrease your risk of colon cancer. One other thing that I want to point out, not necessarily diet related, but another factor that we find decreases colon cancer risk is exercise. So somehow we've already made our way back to, hey guys, let's eat more whole unprocessed food than not and exercise. And that is really what I would want people to focus on in terms of what they can do for decreasing their colon cancer risk versus getting totally freaked out that something they ate had, canola oil in it.
You mentioned measuring fiber. Is there any amount, we talk about dose all the time. Is it worth it all looking at the seed oils in our diet just on like a daily, let's just track it or is it even like, it's just not high on the list of things that you want to be paying attention to or that you would recommend somebody pay attention to?
Yeah, I think we could come up with a better proxy, partially because sometimes we're limited to what data is on nutrition labels. Food manufacturers are required to put certain things on the labels and other things they're not. And so some of these food databases have gotten quite complete with, let's say, also having omega-6 fatty acid breakdown. But because it's not required by manufacturers, a lot of time that data will be missing. If you wanted to do something that was totally comprehensive looking at omega-6 fatty acid intake, you're probably going to be biased low simply because the data isn't there.
Yep.
And really, the goal with looking at omega-6 fats would kind of be more of related to their processed food consumption. And so this is where I would actually point people towards looking at their added sugar, which I know sounds like totally crazy. You're like, EC, you were just talking about fats and now you're talking about added sugar. But remember, the goal here is to sort of get a handle on, hey, what's the processed food volume in my diet? Why do I suggest added sugar? Well, that was now required to be on food labels as of 2020. And so now we can kind of guarantee that that number is there, at least in the US. And so now we can get a more accurate representation of that. And I would generally say that people should keep their added sugar below about 50 grams per day. Again, not a perfect number, but a great proxy of where to start. And I think that will be a good guideline. Again, it's not going to be perfect for omega-6. I understand I'm talking about a different nutrient entirely, but really the goal here is to understand, okay, do I have too many processed foods in my diet without a further, detailed analysis?
Got it. Okay, last question. I want to go back to Marco again. Shout out to Marco. How do, he sent you a couple articles, he sent you the study with question marks, like how does this, I don't get it, and how does this come to be? So I'd love to know just like how do these things come to be such that they do bubble up into our collective consciousness, they do get our attention? Is it nefarious? Are people lying to us? Do they really want us to hate seed oils? Or is it just like research really hard to do and people make mistakes? When you look at this and when you go through the process we just went through and you're like, yeah, that's not it. What do you tend to come away with as the reason that these things do get to us, do get published?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. The first one is that news articles want you to read their publication. Yep. Certainly, we've talked about that before. If they just post fruit and vegetables are still healthy, they're not going to have a ton of readers. I've tried on Instagram, but you got to start getting creative with some posts because people aren't just going to be interested after a few days of that. You have to make the stuff interesting. And so that's some of it, right? They want to make the headline be something really catchy. And then once you get a little bit more into the weeds of the article, you might be like, oh, this isn't quite as black and white as maybe the headline suggested, or this isn't quite as fearful as I thought. So some of it is the news publication wanting to present something new, shocking, of interest so that drive traffic. In one of the articles, the Scientific American one, they did interview kind of the main author of the research, and he was way more gung-ho about the research findings and being like, oh, it's the seed oils and we got to cut back on it. But they also interviewed an independent gastroenterologist who was not part of the study just to sort of say, hey, will you give us a comment on what the study findings were? And the independent guy says, okay, I think diet's important here, but a lot more research needs to be done to really make this string of thoughts and put them together in a whole story. And so I thought that was interesting too, like the researcher's biased. Obviously he just finished a big study. Doing original research is really hard. So he's going to be like, I just solved world peace, basically. Believe me, and I've had very limited lab experience, but I have. It's like when you do a study, like, oh my God, this was amazing, right? And so he's way more gung-ho on it. So I think there's a little bit of like the researcher wants to be able to bring something new to the space. And then I think the news article also wants to have something new that's interesting to the public. And so I think that's how sometimes we get out over our skis a little bit. And it kind of brings us back to one of the questions I know we kick around all the time here is like, well, how is the layperson supposed to go through this? Marco certainly did a really good job on his own doing it and kind of coming to some really great conclusions. some of the stuff we've talked about, like avoid the fear mongering, really stick to the basics. But I think the other thing, especially with all of these new study headlines, new study says this. One study doesn't prove anything. Nothing. There's not one study that's going to come out and I'm like, oh my gosh, everything I said in the last 200 plus podcasts was wrong. There might be a little bit more nuance. There might be a little bit more understanding of some application in some specific scenario, but you want to think about each study as maybe a puzzle piece to like a 10,000 piece puzzle. So try to catch yourself when you see these kind of big headlines, like new study says, there's probably a lot more gray, and they're trying to give you the really big high level highlight to draw your attention than necessarily get you into the weeds of the nuance that we provide here a little more.
I think the fifth name of this podcast is More Research Needs to Be Done.
I know. More research needs to be
After lose
done.
weight and build muscle, dose on the other ones.
We've got some good ones.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Marco again for giving us a reason to talk. Appreciate it. Thank you everybody out there for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I will be back for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project next week.